Something snapped in the global system overnight. Chinese exporters rerouted over $6 billion in high-value components through Southeast Asia, and the shift hit U.S. markets so hard that $200 billion in tech wealth vanished before most Americans woke up. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent was still reviewing the numbers when a deeper blow landed. Mexico, America's central partner in the Cancel China plan, refused to enforce the tariffs Washington was counting on, and while the trade strategy was falling apart, the U.S. quietly withheld the unemployment rate for the first time in modern memory, leaving the Federal Reserve blind as the Nasdaq cracked under the pressure. Bloomberg's port trackers confirmed an almost 9% year-on-year drop in Los Angeles and Long Beach throughput, pulling down automotive modules, semiconductor equipment, and industrial machinery normally insulated from tariff disruptions. Markets reacted immediately. Within minutes of the opening bell, the Nasdaq lost over 2%, erasing around $220 billion in market value. Financial Times analysts attributed the steepest losses to capital-intensive technology firms. Nvidia slipped after Bloomberg reported that its data center revenue had grown more than 40% year-on-year, but was now facing supply timing risks as export restrictions filtered through Asian assembly hubs. TSMC shares weakened after Reuters noted that its U.S. Arizona plant continued to face labor and equipment timing delays. Samsung Electronics fell after a drop in memory chip pricing, while ASML lost ground after the Netherlands began reviewing additional export license boundaries for advanced lithography tools. Strategists quoted in the Financial Times said that global tech valuations were vulnerable because supply lines were shifting faster than capital could reposition. Bessent received a customs analysis that deepened the concern. U.S. imports from China had fallen more than 30% compared with 6 years ago, while imports from Mexico rose around 20% during the same period. Reuters highlighted that Mexico's own imports from China climbed nearly 20% in real terms, showing that Chinese manufacturers were increasingly supplying Mexican plants instead of shipping directly to the United States. Bloomberg's breakdown of Mexico's trade structure showed that roughly 40% of Chinese shipments into Mexico were intermediate goods tied to autos, electronics, and industrial machinery, the exact sectors Washington hoped to insulate from Beijing. Mexico's leadership hesitated to follow Washington's calls for steep tariffs. Reports from El Financiero described heated internal meetings where major industrial groups warned that across $140 billion of Chinese imports, machinery and electronics dominated the import basket. Executives told Bloomberg that replacing Chinese suppliers could take years because cost advantages often exceeded the 25% non-compliance penalty under USMCA rules. Companies estimated that a sudden tariff shock would cascade through Mexico's supply chain, hitting export competitiveness across North America. The auto sector faced the most direct threat. Internal assessments shared with Reuters showed that certain Chinese vehicle modules could face tariff exposures of up to 50% under the plan being discussed. Foreign automakers with long-standing Mexican operations submitted letters warning that production schedules for 2025 and 2026 would destabilize. Battery manufacturers tied to Chinese suppliers signaled they might shift future investments toward Brazil, where Reuters reported a new wave of EV-related foreign direct investment. Mexico's trade deficit with China, approaching $120 billion, captured the scale of its dependence. The Bank of Mexico's inflation projections already showed pressure in goods categories tied to imported machinery and electronics. Bloomberg spoke with economists who warned that higher input costs would roll directly into consumer inflation. With discretionary spending still fragile, the risk extended beyond factories to households, who would shoulder rising prices for appliances, devices, and vehicles. Mexico delayed its tariff decision until December. Reuters said the postponement injected uncertainty into supply chains from Ontario to Monterrey, forcing multinationals to hedge procurement for 2025. Executives quoted in the Financial Times said companies required predictable cost environments to commit capital, and sudden tariff realignments risked diverting future investments to South America or Southeast Asia. Washington confronted its own data crisis simultaneously. The U.S. Labor Department confirmed that the October household employment survey was not conducted during the shutdown, meaning no unemployment rate would be published. Economists interviewed by the Wall Street Journal called the absence unprecedented, noting that the unemployment rate anchors everything from corporate payroll planning to Federal Reserve rate decisions. Without it, U.S. firms were forced to evaluate labor conditions using partial data. Former budget officials told Bloomberg that the shutdown eliminated an estimated 60,000 private sector jobs. Reuters cited government assessments estimating economic losses of roughly $15 billion per week and warned that fourth quarter GDP growth could fall by as much as 1.5 percentage points. Analysts said this reduction could offset gains driven by AI hardware and data center construction, which had propped up GDP growth earlier in the year. The missing unemployment figure amplified monetary uncertainty. The Wall Street Journal reported that the Fed's December decision carries